The scorched horizon of Xerxes Prime burned with the remnants of 1,000 forgotten conflicts. Sergeant Jack Rice watched the preliminary atmospheric readings scroll across his neural interface, each data point a potential death sentence. He ran his fingers along the edge of a worn photograph, a reminder of why Ghost Company existed at all. 15 years earlier, the first contact with the Krell Imperium had been anything but peaceful. Earth's outer colonies had been systematically dismantled, entire populations transformed into raw resource streams for the alien war machine. The United Earth Defense Force had been decimated, reduced to scattered resistance cells and desperate mercenary units. Ghost Company formed from the ashes of those shattered defenses, a collection of soldiers who should have died a dozen times over. Each member carried a story of survival that defied rational explanation. Elena Rodriguez, their captain, was the living embodiment of that defiance. 30 seconds to drop, announced Lazarus, the ship's artificial intelligence. Its voice carried a subtle undertone of anticipation, almost like a predator sensing weakness. The dropship's interior was a study in controlled chaos. Sergeant Rice checked the quantum adaptive armor of Private Aisha Kamel, its surface already beginning to shift and blend with the surrounding environment. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, each motion a testament to the extensive neural reconfiguration that made her more than human, yet fundamentally human at her core. Orbital defense grid is showing multiple inconsistencies, whispered Lieutenant Marcus Chen from his tactical station. His fingers danced across holographic interfaces, weaving a complex web of digital deception. Krell won't know what hit them. Captain Rodriguez stood at the center of this controlled maelstrom. Her cybernetic eye swept across the team, each glance a silent communication of trust and purpose. They were more than a mercenary unit. They were humanity's last best hope. The dropship's hull began to vibrate with a frequency that would have torn apart conventional craft. But Ghost Company was anything but conventional. Quantum stabilization fields rippled across the external skin, absorbing and redistributing the immense atmospheric stress. "Tell me about the local resistance," Rodriguez demanded, her voice cutting through the pre-drop tension. Rice pulled up a holographic map of Xerxes Prime. What's left of them, anyway? The Krell have been systematically eliminating any organized opposition for the past decade. We're looking at scattered survivor groups, mostly hiding in the massive industrial complexes in the southern hemispheric region. A holographic projection materialized between them, a 3D rendering of the planet's surface. Red zones indicated Krell control, blue zones marked potential resistance strongholds. The map was a bleeding wound of territorial conquest. "They've been selling the survivors as computational components," Chen interjected, his usual sardonic humor replaced by a cold rage. "Not just as labor. Their neural networks literally use living beings as processing nodes." Rodriguez's cybernetic eye flickered, processing the information. "Not anymore," she said simply. The dropship's external sensors began to register the first layers of the planet's toxic atmosphere. Conventional craft would have begun to disintegrate. Ghost Company's ship merely adjusted, its adaptive skin changing molecular structure to withstand the corrosive environment. 5 seconds to drop, Lazarus announced. Private Camille checked her weapon, a pulse rifle that was more computational device than traditional firearm. Its adaptive targeting system could predict enemy movements before the enemy itself knew its own intentions. Dropping in 3, Rice counted down. 2, 1. The universe inverted. The impact zone was nothing like standard military calculations predicted. Where a conventional drop would have triggered immediate defensive responses, Ghost Company's landing created a void of impossible information. Private Aisha Kamel was the first to touch ground, her adaptive camouflage rendering her virtually invisible against the metallic landscape of an abandoned Krell processing facility. Massive conduits twisted above her like petrified neural pathways, each one telling a story of industrial conquest and human suffering. Perimeter scan initiated. Chen's voice echoed through her neural link. Unlike traditional communication systems, their network used quantum entanglement, a communication method that existed simultaneously and nowhere, making interception impossible. The facility was a testament to Krell technological supremacy. Massive data cores the size of city blocks hummed with computational power that could process entire planetary populations as raw computational resources. Billions of enslaved minds reduced to living circuitry. Sergeant Reyes materialized beside Kendall, his own adaptive camouflage shifting through microscopic color and texture variations. "These data cores," he whispered, "they're not just storage. They're active neural networks using living beings as processing nodes." A holographic interface erupted from Camille's wrist, her fingers dancing across quantum adaptive projections. Each core represents approximately 3.6 million individual consciousness signatures, she reported. But they're not just stored, they're being actively processed. The horror was clinical, mathematical. Captain Rodriguez's voice cut through their neural link. "Mission parameters remain unchanged. We're here to disrupt, not destroy. Every system we compromise is a system they can't rebuild quickly." Chen began his digital assault. His neural interface was more than a communication device. It was a living weapon. Humanity's last great technological innovation before the Krell invasion had been quantum adaptive networking, where alien systems relied on predictive algorithms and rigid computational models. Human technology embraced chaos. He wasn't hacking the system. He was infecting it. Microscopic quantum algorithms began to spread through the Krell's computational matrix. They didn't break the system. They confused it. Each algorithm was a small piece of impossible mathematics, creating computational paradoxes that the rigid Krell systems couldn't resolve. "First-layer defenses are responding," Chen muttered. "They're trying to isolate the infection, but they don't understand the nature of the attack." The Krell's computational systems were designed for absolute precision. They could predict military movements with 99.997% accuracy. They could calculate the trajectory of a single particle across multiple dimensional spaces. But they couldn't handle true randomness. And randomness was humanity's greatest weapon. Reyes moved through the facility, his adaptive camouflage rendering him a living shadow. Massive computational nodes began to flicker. Not fail, just hesitate. "They're processing our presence," Camille observed. "But they can't categorize us." Quantum-level infiltration was more than a technical achievement. It was a philosophical assault. The Krell understood computation as a linear process: input, calculation, output. Humans introduced something far more dangerous: uncertainty. Chen's algorithms weren't just breaking the system. They were teaching it to dream. A massive data core suddenly pulsed with unexpected light. Not a system failure, something else. Something the Krell computational matrix had never encountered. Curiosity. "Captain," Chen's voice carried a note of wonder, "I think we're doing more than disrupting their systems. We're evolving them." Rodriguez's response was immediate. "Maintain mission parameters. We're not here to understand. We're here to liberate." But something fundamental had changed. The line between technological assault and first contact had blurred. The abandoned Krell facility began to pulse with a light that was neither mechanical nor organic. Something new was emerging, something that defied the rigid computational models of the Krell Imperium. Something human. The first human to truly understand psychological warfare wasn't a soldier. It was Dr. Elena Rodriguez's grandmother, a behavioral economist who studied collective trauma in post-conflict societies. Those lessons now echoed through Ghost Company's most devastating weapon: understanding. Deep within the Krell's neural-linked battalions, something unprecedented began to happen. The holographic projections weren't just visual deceptions. They were precision-crafted psychological interventions. Private Camille monitored the psychological feedback loops. Each projection was a carefully constructed narrative designed to exploit the most fundamental weaknesses in the Krell's collective consciousness. Their military was built on absolute certainty, a hierarchical system where doubt was a fatal vulnerability. Target Battalion is experiencing cascading cognitive dissonance," she reported, her voice clinical, but carrying an underlying current of fascination. The Krell troops saw versions of themselves failing, not just dying, failing. Their neural interfaces projected scenarios where their most decorated commanders made catastrophic mistakes, where legendary units were overwhelmed by impossible tactics, where their entire understanding of warfare collapsed. Sergeant Reyes understood the true weapon. "It's not about what they see," he explained to a junior team member. "It's about what they begin to believe about themselves." In the command center of the nearest Krell battle group, Commander Zarnak watched in mounting horror. The holographic displays showed multiple simultaneous engagements, each more impossible than the last. Units reported encountering enemies that moved like liquid thought, that existed in multiple locations simultaneously. But it was more than tactical confusion. The projections began to whisper, not with words, but with implications. Memories of subjugated species, glimpses of civilizations destroyed. The psychological warfare wasn't just about defeating the current battle, it was about dismantling the entire moral framework of the Krell Imperium. Lieutenant Chen's algorithms were doing something unprecedented. They weren't just generating false images. They were mining the Krell's own communication networks, extracting deeply buried memories, traumas, and doubts. Each holographic projection was a personalized psychological landmine. The Krell tactical unit began to fragment, not through physical destruction, but through existential doubt. "We're seeing a 0.03% deviation in collective response," Cumnal observed. Her voice carried a note of scientific detachment, but her hands were clenched. "That might seem small, but in their system, it's equivalent to a complete systemic breakdown." Captain Rodriguez understood the true battlefield. Warfare wasn't about destroying bodies. It was about breaking belief systems. The holographic projections began to evolve. They weren't just showing potential failures. They were showing alternative histories, scenarios where the Krell could have chosen cooperation over conquest, where their technological brilliance could have been used to heal rather than destroy. Commander Zarnak watched a projection of his own younger self, a version that chose a different path, a version that understood compassion. "This is impossible," he whispered. But impossibility was humanity's specialty. The psychological assault wasn't just tactical. It was philosophical. Ghost Company was forcing the Krell to confront the fundamental lie of their imperial expansion, that technological superiority equaled moral justification. In a small chamber deep within the facility, a single Krell soldier dropped his weapon. Then another. Then an entire unit. They weren't surrendering. They were choosing to see differently. Captain Rodriguez's cybernetic eye tracked the cascading psychological intervention. This wasn't just a battle. It was a form of forced collective therapy for an entire species that had forgotten how to question its own assumptions. Psychological disruption at 47.3%, Kamil reported. Chen grinned. "We're just getting started." The true war wasn't happening on the battlefield. It was happening in the space between thoughts, in the moment of hesitation before absolute certainty. And humanity, with its capacity for empathy, for understanding, for seeing multiple perspectives, was finally weaponizing its most fundamental strength: doubt, imagination, hope. The resistance began not with weapons, but with a whisper. Deep beneath the industrial wastelands of Xerxes Prime, generations of subjugated species had learned the art of survival through invisibility. Kira, a young Zornak salvage worker, discovered the first transmission buried in the background noise of the planet's communication grid. It wasn't a conventional signal. The Ghost Company's communication was a quantum-encrypted message that existed in a state of probabilistic existence, simultaneously transmitted and not transmitted. Traditional monitoring systems couldn't even perceive its existence. The message was an invitation, not just to rebel, but to understand. Buried in layers of adaptive code were comprehensive survival modules, tactical training programs, psychological resilience techniques, but more than that, they were stories. narratives of resistance from 100 different civilizations that had faced impossible odds. Kira's workspace was a labyrinth of discarded technological components, a graveyard of broken dreams and stolen potential. Her people, the Zornak, had been reduced to living computational nodes, their consciousness parceled out as processing units for the Krell Imperium. The first group gathered in the maintenance tunnels beneath Processing Cluster 17. They were broken, scarred. Each bore the neural interface markers of complete subjugation. But something had changed. The transmission from Ghost Company wasn't just information. It was a form of psychological inoculation. Each module contained not just tactical knowledge, but a fundamental reimagining of self-worth. "We are not resources," became their first shared mantra. Sergeant Reyes had designed these modules with a specific understanding. Resistance wasn't about weapons. It was about reclaiming narrative. In the deepest levels of the underground network, a new form of communication began to emerge. The salvage workers, the computational slaves, the discarded populations of a dozen conquered species started to share something the Krell could never understand: hope, and its more dangerous cousin, imagination. Lieutenant Chen monitored the transmission patterns. This wasn't just a communication network. It was a living, breathing organism of collective potential. Each transmission adjusted itself, learning, evolving. "They're not just receiving," Chen reported to Rodriguez. "They're collaborative participants." The Krell's monitoring systems began to register anomalies, tiny fractures in their absolute control. A worker would hesitate before completing a task. A computational node would introduce an unexpected variable into a calculation. Micro-resistances, invisible rebellions. Kira discovered her first true weapon. Not a pulse rifle, not an explosive device, but understanding. The transmission modules contained more than tactical information. They were comprehensive education packages, quantum learning systems that could be absorbed almost instantaneously through neural interfaces, mathematics that revealed the fundamental lie of the Krell's computational hierarchy, historical narratives of civilizations that had survived impossible odds, psychological reconstruction techniques that helped individuals reclaim their sense of agency. In the maintenance tunnels, something unprecedented happened. The subjugated species began to see themselves not as victims, but as potential liberators. Captain Rodriguez understood the true nature of their intervention. This wasn't just about military victory. It was about systemic transformation. "We're not giving them weapons," she explained to Chen. "We're giving them the ability to reimagine themselves." The resistance spread like a living thought, not through violence, through understanding. By the time the Krell realized what was happening, it was already too late. The computational slaves were no longer just nodes in a system. They were becoming something else, something fundamentally uncontrollable, something human. The Krell High Command assembled in the Obsidian Spire, a massive computational fortress that was more living organism than structure. Holographic interfaces pulsed with data streams that would have driven a human mind to instantaneous madness. Fleet Admiral Vornak studied the impossible data before him. Their computational models predicted absolute victory with 98% certainty. And yet, something fundamental was breaking down. "Initiate the convergence protocol," he commanded. It was their ultimate weapon. Not a physical armada, but a computational assault designed to crush any resistance at the neural network level. Thousands of battleships moved with mathematical precision, their trajectories calculated down to the quantum probability of individual atom movements. But precision was about to meet something far more dangerous: human unpredictability. Inside the Ghost Company's command ship, Captain Rodriguez understood the nature of the incoming assault. This wasn't just a military engagement. It was a computational war that would determine the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. Lieutenant Chen's fingers danced across quantum adaptive interfaces. "They're bringing everything," he reported. His voice carried a mixture of professional calm and something else: excitement. The Krell's convergence protocol was designed to be absolute. Every computational pathway would be locked down. Every potential resistance node would be systematically eliminated. It was a digital neutron bomb, destroying resistance while leaving the infrastructure intact. Sergeant Reyes monitored the incoming computational waves. "They're not just trying to defeat us," he observed. "They're trying to erase the very possibility of resistance." But Ghost Company had been preparing for this moment since their first encounter with the Krell Imperium. Their defensive systems weren't about blocking the incoming assault. They were about transforming it. Each incoming computational wave was met not with resistance, but with adaptive redirection. Where the Krell expected solid defensive barriers, they found something far more terrifying: a living, breathing network that absorbed, transformed, and redirected their assault. Kira, in the underground resistance networks, felt the assault differently. The neural interfaces that once controlled her began to change. What was meant to be a crushing computational attack became something else entirely. A liberation. The Krell's ultimate weapon began to turn against them. Their precise calculations encountered something they could never understand: human creativity. Each computational pathway was transformed, redirected, given new meaning. Admiral Vornak watched in growing horror as their perfect assault began to fragment. It wasn't that their attack was failing. It was becoming something else entirely. Computational integrity at 73%, a subordinate reported. But the number meant nothing. Integrity was no longer a measurable concept. Captain Rodriguez understood the true nature of their intervention. This wasn't about defeating the Krell. It was about forcing them to evolve. "We're not destroying their system," she told Chen. "We're teaching it to dream." The battle occurred in spaces between thoughts, in quantum probabilities, in the moment between certainty and possibility. Entire battle groups found themselves redirected, not destroyed, transformed. Ships that were preparing to obliterate resistance found themselves performing impossible maneuvers. Computational nodes designed for absolute control began to generate unexpected outputs. It was warfare beyond physical space, beyond traditional understanding. A new form of conflict was emerging, one where victory wasn't about destruction, but about fundamental transformation. The Krell Imperium was about to learn the most dangerous lesson of all. Humanity's true strength was never about force. It was about potential. The first human consciousness transfer hadn't been a military breakthrough. It was an act of desperate medical innovation during Earth's last global conflict, a moment when humanity faced potential extinction. Dr. Aria Rodriguez, Alina's mother, had developed the initial prototype in a makeshift research facility hidden beneath the ruins of Buenos Aires. Her team's work began as a way to preserve human memories, to ensure that knowledge survived even if individual bodies did not. Now that technology had become Ghost Company's most profound weapon. Private Connell stood at the interface of something beyond traditional understanding. The consciousness transfer system wasn't just a technological marvel, it was a philosophical revolution. Initiating full neural mapping, she reported, her voice calm despite the magnitude of what was happening. The process defied everything the Krell understood about individual existence. Where the alien Imperium saw consciousness as a fixed computational resource, humans viewed it as a fluid, adaptive network. Sergeant Reyes was the first test subject. His body lay motionless, neural interfaces creating a complex lattice of quantum-entangled connections. But consciousness was no longer confined to a single physical form. Lieutenant Chen monitored the transfer protocols. "Neural integrity at 99.7%, he announced. "But that's almost meaningless. We're beyond traditional metrics." The transfer wasn't about moving a consciousness from one body to another. It was about creating a collaborative network of experience. Memories, skills, emotional responses all became shareable resources. A wounded soldier could instantly transfer not just technical skills, but the nuanced understanding gained through moments of crisis. Fear, hope, the inexplicable human capacity for improvisation. The Krell watching through their computational interfaces couldn't comprehend what they were seeing. This wasn't just technology. It was a fundamental reimagining of individual existence. In the underground resistance networks, Kira watched the first full transfer with a mixture of terror and wonder. The human soldiers moved with a fluidity that defied traditional understanding of individual identity. One moment, Sergeant Reyes was a battle-hardened veteran with 15 years of combat experience. The next, that entire lifetime of knowledge flowed into a younger soldier's neural network. Not as a simple data transfer, but as a living, breathing experience. Captain Rodriguez understood the true nature of their innovation. We're not just sharing information, she explained to Chen. We're creating a collective consciousness that adapts in real time. The Krell's rigid hierarchical systems began to fracture. Their understanding of individual existence, carefully constructed over millennia of computational evolution, couldn't process this new form of being. A soldier could die, and yet not die. Experience could be preserved, shared, transformed. Chen discovered something unexpected during the monitoring process. The consciousness transfers weren't just preserving individual experiences. They were creating something entirely new. A collective intelligence that was more than the sum of its parts. We're seeing emergent behavior patterns, he reported. The neural network is developing predictive capabilities that go beyond individual computational limits. The resistance members watching through hidden interfaces began to understand. This wasn't just a military technology. It was a fundamental reimagining of what it meant to be an individual. Kira watched as a wounded soldier's memories of a distant homeworld flowed into the neural network of a younger fighter. Not as a cold data transfer, but as a living, breathing experience of hope, of survival. The Krell computational systems tried to analyze the transfer, but their algorithms encountered something impossible to quantify. Humanity's capacity for empathy, for connection, for reimagining the very nature of existence. Captain Rodriguez stood at the center of this transformation. Her cybernetic eye tracked the impossible data streams. This was more than a weapon. It was an evolution. The first true revolution began in the spaces between battles. Across multiple star systems, the enslaved species of the Krell Imperium started to recognize something fundamental. This wasn't just a military conflict. It was a war of imagination. Kira stood in the central hub of the underground resistance, watching as the first truly collaborative resistance network took shape. Communication was no longer about simple data transfer. It was about shared experience, collective memory, instantaneous learning. The Krell had built their empire on a simple premise: control through computational certainty. Every species they conquered was reduced to a predictable resource. Mathematical models predicted rebellion with such accuracy that resistance seemed mathematically impossible. But mathematics had never encountered human unpredictability. Lieutenant Chen tracked the spread of resistance across multiple star systems. It wasn't a coordinated assault. It was something far more dangerous. A collective awakening. We're seeing exponential growth in adaptive resistance networks, he reported to Captain Rodriguez. But it's not linear. It's organic. The resistance wasn't just fighting. It was reimagining possibilities. On mining colonies, workers began to modify their neural interfaces, not to resist directly, but to create new forms of communication. Computational nodes designed for absolute control became conduits of shared experience. A Zornak mining engineer would suddenly understand the tactical knowledge of a resistance fighter. A computational slave would carry the memories of 100 different worlds. The rigid separation between species, between individuals, began to dissolve. Sergeant Reyes understood the true nature of their intervention. We're not just providing tactical information, he explained to a group of newly liberated resistance members. We're teaching you how to dream differently. The Krell, watching through their computational networks, saw something they could not comprehend. Rebellion was spreading faster than any viral network, but it wasn't about destruction. It was about creation. Entire planetary systems began to shift, not through violent overthrow, but through fundamental reimagination. Manufacturing centers designed to produce weapons began to produce something else: Communication networks meant to suppress began to connect. Neural interfaces created to control became conduits of collective potential. Captain Rodriguez stood at the center of this transformation. Her cybernetic eye tracked impossible data streams that defied traditional understanding of conflict. "This isn't a war," she told Chen. "This is a birth." The Krell High Command watched in growing horror. Their computational models, which had predicted every possible resistance scenario with 99.99% accuracy, began to fragment. How do you predict the impossible? Kira discovered something profound. Resistance wasn't about fighting. It was about reimagining. A mining colony would suddenly develop agricultural techniques that transformed barren worlds. A computational processing center would become a center of artistic creation. Neural networks designed for absolute control became conduits of collective creativity. The resistance spread like a living thought, not through violence, through understanding. Lieutenant Chen's monitoring systems detected something unprecedented. The resistance networks were developing their own form of collective intelligence, not a hive mind, something far more complex. A collaborative consciousness that respected individual experience while creating something greater. "They're not just sharing information," Chen reported. "They're creating." The Krill had built an empire on the premise that control was the ultimate form of power. They were about to learn a fundamental truth. Creativity was more powerful than control. Imagination was the ultimate weapon. And humanity had just taught the galaxy how to dream. In the final confrontation, Ghost Company didn't just defeat the Krell, they redefined the very concept of warfare. Captain Elena Rodriguez stood not as a military leader, but as a living symbol of humanity's most profound strength, the ability to transform the impossible into reality. The Galactic Concordance, which had once dismissed humans as a minor species, now understood that true power wasn't about technology or force. It was about the capacity to reimagine limitations. Epilogue. Ghost Company became more than a military legend. They were proof that humanity's greatest weapon was never a technology or a strategy, but the audacious belief that no obstacle was truly insurmountable.